Well, hello, this is Bob Harrington from Stanford University. Today, I'm really privileged to have joining me as a guest a longtime friend and colleague, Dr. Frank Harrell. Frank is a professor of biostatistics at Vanderbilt University School of Medicine. He's also an expert statistical advisor to the FDA Center on Drug Evaluation Research in their biostatistical group.
Absolute pleasure to be here, Bob.
Frank, you and I have known each other and have worked together many times over the years. For our listeners, why don't you give a little background, your educational background, and how you ended up coming out of your PhD training at Duke University, and then maybe we'll get into a little bit of the history of the Duke Databank at that point.
Wonderful. So I had a really interesting background, at least interesting to me, because I was bored one summer when I was 16 or 15 years old. My mother said, you know, they've got volunteer opportunities at the VA hospital in Birmingham, and I took that opportunity and I started working with physicians for the first time. This was in gastroenterology, and I started to see the physiologic data they were collecting from motility studies. And then I crossed over to working in cardiology as I became an undergraduate student at University of Alabama, Birmingham, working with a lot of physiologic data and also helping to automate the pressure waveform analysis in their cath lab. And in those early days, the close relationships with clinician investigators was something that really thrilled me, and it was very challenging and fun. And also I realized that I liked the math part of it, and I didn't like the long hours of the clinicians I was working with. So that helped push me. And then I had unbelievable advice from the head of biostatistics at UAB, David Hurst, who was a visionary. He said, you need to go into biostatistics, go to University of North Carolina, and your supporting program needs to be biomedical engineering and computer science. And I did exactly what he said, except my supporting program was biomedical engineering and physiology. And that was the best advice I've ever gotten. It was just unbelievable.
Frank, what year was that?
That was in 1973.
So when you think about that, that was visionary thinking. That was years ahead of where the field was going.
Just incredible. And Dave Hurst was somebody who was a data guru, so he knew more things to do with data and putting multiple tools together that no one else thought of putting together. That was a real inspiration for me, but getting me aligned to a career where he said not only will you have fun and there will be great challenges, but the job opportunities are unlimited, and that's always been the case. So I worked on probably the most expensive clinical trial NIH ever undertook when I was a graduate student at UNC Chapel Hill. That was the Lipids Research Clinics program.
Oh, sure.
Studying cholestyramine for cardiovascular death and myocardial infarction. We were the data coordinating center. So I learned something about clinical trials and the data and data management and research operations of clinical trials. And then Kerry Lee, my longtime colleague at Duke University that you know very well, he was on my dissertation committee at UNC Biostat, and he recruited me to Duke. Joining the Duke Databank for cardiovascular disease was also one of the best things I ever did. So that was in 1978, and so Bob Rosati was there, and Phil Harris was there. Shortly thereafter, it was David Pryor, Mark Latke, Rob Califf, and then you came along a little bit later.
Pretty exciting time. Let's pause for a minute and let the audience know the concept of the data bank. As I understood the history, Gene Stead, who had been the chair of medicine in the 60s and 70s at Duke, had this notion that the human brain could not aggregate and analyze all of the data that was coming in through the clinical practice setting. So he thought, well, let's use this new device, the computer, to collect, to aggregate, and then to help analyze the data. It was in some ways that simple, but in some ways that's so far ahead of what the rest of the world was doing at that time.
Gene Stead was so far ahead, it's hard to even fathom it. He believed in data, and he got us to formulate something called the prognostogram, where every patient coming with chest pain getting a cardiac catheterization got a customized survival curve estimate for them based on the current follow-up in the Duke Databank, customized to their characteristics, especially their coronary obstructive disease and other risk factors, compared the survival curve for those getting CABG with those getting medical therapy, I think Bob Rosati probably called it a prognostogram. Gene Stead called it a second opinion. And he got insurance companies to pay for this as a second opinion, I believe.
I didn't know that last part about the insurance companies. That sounds very Stead-like, though, doesn't it?
Oh, yes.
I'm sitting in my office now at Stanford, and on my wall I have a picture of the variables in the multivariate analysis taken from the first article about the prognostogram. They gave me one of the pictures when I left the data bank years ago. Next to that is a picture of the 25th anniversary of the data bank faculty with you and I in the picture together. It's kind of fun to hear you talk about the prognostogram, but it really was this fundamental observation, wasn't it, that data could more effectively drive clinical decision-making than anecdote.
It certainly was. And Gene Stead had another attribute, which is he had a long history working with UNC biostatistics, and he thought biostatistics were important team players in this new collaborative environment. He fostered that, and he helped recruit that way and kept a bridge with UNC Chapel Hill. The respect that he showed for people who were not MDs was very obvious, and that fostered the great start we had at the Duke Data Bank, which led into the way the Duke Clinical Research Institute was created.
Let's talk about the early data bank days, because I think you're hitting upon some key lessons that I think have real relevance today. And you bring it up with Dr. Stead in his creation of teams. That's always struck me, Frank, as one of the key lessons of the data bank is that clinical research is a team sport, and you need people coming from very different backgrounds. What always struck me about the data bank in the conferences that we would have was that there were statisticians who understood the clinical issues and that there were clinicians who understood the quantitative issues. Do you want to talk about that a little bit and maybe talk about some of those early days of the data bank conferences, which as a fellow in the data bank were absolutely frightening?
Yeah, we tried to make them frightening in a fun sort of way because the statisticians got a kick out of challenging the clinicians and clinicians right back to the statisticians. Some of that was intentional, but I think it was always in the most fun intellectual spirit. And before we had those formal conferences, we had these informal conferences that took place in the room 2000 of the old Duke Hospital, which was a big computer room, and we had this big old computer there, mainframe sort of computer. We'd bring some chairs out to the middle of this big room, and then you would have the cardiologists and the statisticians, and at that point it was Carrie Lee and myself. We would have these almost staged arguments, and they were intended to be loud and challenging because everyone knew what motivated everyone else was seeking a better approach to a certain research problem. So one of the most vivid memories I have is sitting around that room having an argument about how to treat New York Heart Association class for congestive heart failure as an adjustment variable in a regression model. Should we have class 1 to 4 as some sort of linear effect, or should we have not assume anything about the impact of that New York Heart Association score by having just 3 indicator variables? And then what would the reference group be? So we had this big argument about what the reference would be when you're coding a 4-level categorical variable, because we wanted all of our statistical results going forward to be interpretable by the clinician. So we had the luxury of arguing about those sort of things as long as we wanted to. And there was a difference in those days. The pressures that clinicians were under were far different than they are today. And I would say much less pressure because there wasn't all the caseload and billing and resource units and all of these things. But also another big factor was that when you would submit an NIH grant proposal, of course, our group was sort of ahead of the data-based way of thinking about cardiology, and we were pretty good at getting grants. But in those days, when you get a grant, the efforts that were supported by the grant were really adequate, sometimes even more than adequate to the goals of the grant. So you would have people on, 25, 30, 40% effort sometimes. The generous NIH funding in those days, before we had this super competitive mode of operating we have now, and of course we have a lot more researchers now competing for funds, but that was a luxury that we'll probably never see again, but it was something to cherish because the kind of collegial interactions that it created was truly magical.
I think that is one of the great lessons of the data bank is that You need time devoted, whether you're a clinician or biostatistician, to learn the issues germane to the field. And then you need the teams coming together who can actually have time to spend together. I fully agree with you. Those days of being able to argue and discuss and really dissect a problem were critical in terms of moving the field forward that we were interested in. As you talk about how you thought, for example, about New York Heart Association class, as you thought about how you insert it into a model, it reminds me of one of the great achievements of the group during the 70s and 80s was really thinking about how one handles non-randomized data when one wants to think about making treatment inferences. Now, that has some relevance today. You want to talk about those days, Frank, of how people thought about that issue?
Yeah, it was controversial even then because there were early randomized trials, as one that was done in the VA system, for bypass surgery versus medical therapy in obstructive CAD. People realized that the ability to randomize patients even early on then, and some of these trials started in, 1970 or something, sometimes there were difficulty randomizing patients, especially enough patients in specific disease severity groups where maybe the practicing community did not think there was equipoise. We were believers in observational data, and over time, we came to believe that our trust in observational data was just a little bit too great. The success of the randomized trials was maybe slightly overestimated. So somewhere in the middle, there is a truth. But there were a lot of arguments about this, and we went to a lot of conferences where people would present randomized trial data and people would present observational data and have big arguments with each other. And, of course, some of the ones that are easiest to argue with are where, say, surgeons were presenting their experience at their medical center with bypass surgery, not having any control group whatsoever, and that was pretty easy to go after, but the surgeons didn't quite understand the weakness of that approach. But it was always controversial, and over time we started doing, and Mark Halatke really led this effort, comparisons, very strong comparisons with the observational data predictions of how patients are going to fare with the different treatments, and compared and matching as best as we could with the randomized trial data as those data were published. So it's quite an interesting story and never super clear and never without controversy.
Frank, I could keep talking with you all day. My guest has been Dr. Frank Harrell, a professor of biostatistics at Vanderbilt University School of Medicine. Frank, thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me. I really enjoyed it, Bob.